Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hope you're having an amazing day. For the next generation of consoles, will Sony be taking a leaf out of Microsoft's book and releasing two variants of the PS6? One being cheaper but much less capable, and the other more expensive but a much more powerful design. Or is there something more interesting that's going on here? Well, first of all, let's give you an overview of the information. So Kepler L2, who is a very well-known leaker, has stated that Sony does indeed seem to be working on two different APUs. Now, all they've said is that one design does seem to be much more physically capable. In other words, it's got more computing power, but it's most likely much more expensive. The other is a more affordable design. Now, just to get everyone up to speed, a couple of days ago it was reported, and I covered this, that AMD have indeed seemed to have won the contract to produce the APU for the PlayStation 6, and there are ultimately several reasons that Sony stuck with AMD. One, of course, is backwards compatibility, i.e. they can make certain that the console runs flawlessly with the PS5 and PS4. The fact is also that AMD are very willing to work with Sony's teams and customize the hardware as necessary. And the fact is, honestly, Sony at this stage have a really good rapport with AMD, and obviously if you kind of know, the engineers and you have a good working relationship with them, it just makes things smoother and simpler, right? And also from a business sense, AMD are very willing to give some really good concessions and essentially do things for a good price. All of this, plus the fact that AMD's roadmap is pretty robust. They've got a really good graphics and CPU IP, and also some really cool APUs of their own. And I think it was just ultimately a good decision. But again, there were other companies in contention for the contract. Nvidia was one that I'd been hearing. There was also Qualcomm. Intel also were being reported to have tendered for the contract. But ultimately, once again, it seems that AMD were the company that Sony are sticking with. So I decided to reach out to some sources regarding this information. Now, if you're new to the channel, I've also leaked some other stuff for the PS6 in the past, and I will go over that a little bit in this video, but ultimately, at this stage, there are a lot of rumours already for the PlayStation 6, but it seems that for around a year now, roughly speaking, perhaps even a little longer, Sony have been speaking to developers, basically getting an understanding of the lie of the land. And this is not just in terms of their desires for hardware improvements over the PS5, i.e. what are the sticking points? How much more RAM do you need? What about GPU performance? What about ray tracing? All of that stuff. Like, those are very important questions, but there's also a lot of other things that are very important as well. Like, for example, what about the development environments? What about the ecosystem that we're fostering so you can maximize profits in a game and also drive player engagement, which is obviously good for, well, Sony, but it's also good for EA, Ubisoft, Capcom, and so on. And there are a lot of other questions, of course, that Sony are asking, and they're also working with their own internal studios to figure out what is most important. And obviously it is a balancing act, because stuff is, well, expensive. So, for example, if you have a specific price target, you can't just be like, well, you know what, we're going to put in like 128 gigabytes of GDDR7, because you might just blow a little bit of your budget on that, and obviously you still need other things to make the console work. Now, according to the information that I've been hearing anyway, and again, I really want to stress that this stuff could have changed. The dual SoC, or dual APU, whatever you want to say, does seem to be true. So I am almost positive Kepler is right here. Now, I've spoken to a couple of sources, and their information at this stage is a little bit old, so it's very possible that things may have changed, i.e. this design, these two APUs could be for a single PS6-ish design, but at least from what I've heard, this does not seem to be the case. So there is a single PS6 that is being worked on. I won't elaborate further for now on that. I'll talk more about the hardware in a second. But I'm going to call that SoC A. So it doesn't matter the specifications. Just say SoC A, just in your head, just to make things simple. SoC B is not for another PS6. What it seems to be, however, is a SoC that has two purposes. Now, how these purposes exactly come into being is a little less clear. So basically, it seems to have at least two purposes, however. One is driving a PSVR 3, and two is to actually have some type of handheld gaming device. So yes, you could essentially say a PlayStation Portable follow-up or whatever. To be clear, this is not a PlayStation Portal. This is its own device, so you could run it on a train, you could run it on a plane, you could run it in outer space, you could be on the Starship Enterprise in, several hundred years' time with no Wi-Fi, and you'd still be good, providing you have, of course, charge. Now, this is where things get a little nutty, and this is where things get quite complicated, because the PSVR 3 implementation may also be its own independent device. Now, unfortunately, this is where things get a little bit complicated. I am uncertain whether the PSVR 3 can be powered by the portable, or whether the PSVR 3 has its own SoC. But what was told to me is that you can bypass the lower end device. So let's say the PSVR 3 does have its own APU by essentially plugging it into a PS6. So in essence, in that respect, it kind of acts like a PlayStation Portal now, where the SoC on the console is dummy, it's not doing anything. The PS6 itself is responsible for all processing. Now, I really want to stress that this is something that may not come to fruition, because again, these are questions that are being asked by Sony internally, and even if the actual APU is being designed, it may be cancelled. A good example of this is the APU for the Xbox Sabin consoles. Now, Sabin, for those who aren't too familiar, you can search for it on the channel. Xbox Sabin, that's S-A-B-I-N. It was basically how do I describe this? It was an Xbox Series S, but had elements of RDNA 3 and some other bits and pieces, a machine learning block. It was going to be essentially a slightly more expensive Series S, but was going to have much more improved graphical capabilities. However, it was canned by Microsoft. So the design had not been finalized, but the company were basically at the stage where they kind of knew what they wanted to do, but it just didn't get the go-ahead. And things can be canned at any time. So, again, I really want to stress this may have changed. Now, I'm sure many of you would agree that the PlayStation Portal is a pretty cool device. It's not necessarily something that I personally need in my home, but it's quite popular with a lot of folks. But if you look on the channel, PlayStation Handheld, before the PlayStation Portal was announced, for quite some time I'd been saying that Sony were working on a handheld, and at that time my information was that they were actually designing a system that would be independent, so you could say it was a Vita 2. So basically, for whatever reason, Sony seemed to have abandoned that, at least at that stage, and wanted to go with a cheaper design. Maybe they were testing the market, maybe they didn't feel that they could put out this console at a good price to compete with the Switch, whatever reason. But now, obviously, things are changing, and we've seen the market really just evolve. The Switch is obviously absolutely blown up. The Switch 2, allegedly is going to be announced later this year, although I'll wait and see on that one, because the number of times that we've heard, yeah, trust me, the Switch 2 is about to be released any moment now, guys. Like, this has been like... I'm actually somewhat losing interest in the Switch 2, just because I feel like it's so freaking late to the market, but I don't want to go on a whole rant and tangent about that. Obviously, we've seen devices like the Steam Deck do super well, and a slightly more expensive one, the ROG Ally as well. So I think Sony sees that there is a lot of potential in the market. Now, whether or not the PlayStation VR 3 ever sees the light of day, I'm not too certain what the sales figures are of the PSVR 2, to be honest, and what Sony would consider success. I can certainly see, however, you know, the reality is that at this stage, they're working on the design to really, you know, work quite well on the PC, and it looks pretty cool from what I understand. So I could certainly see Sony wanted to continue that. Obviously, the other rumor is that Microsoft are working on their own handheld, though God knows what Microsoft's long-term strategy is for consoles. I mean, Sarah Bond is stating that the next generation Xbox is going to be the biggest technical leap ever. And I really struggle to square that in my head. And the main reason is just because, obviously, technical innovation at this point, like, okay, look at the PS1 to PS2, or the Sega Genesis to the PlayStation 1, or the Sega Saturn, or the NES to the SNES. You get the idea. Like, those leaps are just ridiculous. And I'm not saying the PS4 to PS5 or the Xbox One X to whatever suck. It's just that the rate of advancements are just slowing down. So it's like, ultimately this has to be things like machine learning and AI and all that stuff, which I definitely think could be cool. But it's going to be very interesting. The rumor is that this is going to be announced next year with possibly a 2026 release date. Again, I'll wait and see whether that's the case. Frankly, Microsoft's approach to the next generation seems to be really up in the air at this point. I'll be very curious to see what happens as well with all the ports that they've been putting out on the PlayStation consoles. I'll be very interested to see whether those, you know, whether we get like Forza or Gears, whatever, on the PlayStation 5. It's going to be very interesting to see what Microsoft announced, basically. Just to finish up regarding the PS6, there are a lot of rumours that I've been hearing regarding some of Sony's plans or approaches for the console, but again, at this point, the specifications are not solid. It will, of course, again be using AMD for the APU and for the APU, which means CPU and GPUs are probably going to be based on Zen and probably UDNA. For those who don't know, the data center CDNA and gaming RDNA are doing that. They're basically merging. And it seems that AMD are essentially renaming its graphics to UDNA. And there are going to be some differences, like the types of memory that are supported and so on and so on. But it's going to be very interesting to see how Sony approaches this. The PS6, from what I understand, is going to be doubling down on stuff like machine learning, AI, pushing physics, so collision detection, cloth simulation, water simulation, you know, all of those type of things that make the world a lot more interactive. It's going to be very interesting to see what they do there. Ultimately, like, AI and upscaling, like, native resolutions are just done at this point, right? They're just dead. Even on PC, like Nvidia just recently said, this is not a verbatim quote, but you can Google it and you'll see the reports on it. But they basically said that for every 1 pixel we render, 32 are generated via AI. And it's like, well, how do they come up with those numbers? Now, I'm not certain, because Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of Nvidia, didn't really elaborate on exactly how he concluded those numbers. But my guess is over an X time frame. So, for example, like 1 to 2 seconds or 10 seconds or what have you. So he's probably counting DLSS, maybe scaling from like ultra performance probably to 4K. So that would be 720p to 4K, and probably including stuff like DLSS frame generation, which is obviously where you're inserting AI generated frames. So like, plus that, obviously there's stuff like ray tracing reconstruction and all this other stuff. And ultimately it's like, if you look at the PS5 Pro, it's got 60 compute units. Now, let's just be very... let's boil things down and be really simple about this for a second. and I'm going to miss out on a lot of technical nuances just for simplicity's sake. Let's assume that you were to double that. That's 120 compute units. Let's even say it's more. Let's say it's like, I don't know, 140. Plus you've got additional clock frequency. These are not specs. I want to be clear. These are not specs of the PS6. I'm giving you an example. But let's say you were to go with 140 compute units. You increase the clock frequency, I don't know, 3 gigahertz, let's just hypothetically say, and you add a bunch of IPC improvements. So you've got extra cache, the GPU is just more performant, blah 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 blah. Okay, let's say you're a 3x multiplier of visual quality. Let's be really, really, really aggressive and say 3.2 or 3.5. Okay, that's much faster than a PS5 Pro. Or a PS5, excuse me, base model system. But it's not that much more impressive than a PS5 Pro. I mean, obviously you've got way more CPU performance, but even if you were to double the PS5 Pro, hell, if you were to go with like 2.5 times, and this is like the big thing, of course, we've seen with the PS5, right? Like, if you look at the PS5, it is a lot more performant than the PS4 Pro, for example. But you've included things like ray tracing, all of these other cool things. So again, it isn't just like more T-flops, more compute, more... It has to be like a lot of different factors that come together to make consoles just much more performant nowadays. So I think, you know, native resolutions are essentially dead. From what I've heard, and this may have changed, Sony are looking at a chiplet design for the PS6. Whether this is going to be something they end up pursuing, I honestly don't know. But it seems that there's going to be a large LLC on it, which is last level cache. So it's kind of like what we've seen with like RDNA Freeze N31 and 32. And also future AMD APUs as well. We're going to have this. Again, whether this is going to be the same for the consoles, I don't know, because Sony just might say, yeah, no, that's way too expensive. But the whole reason they're doing this is so that you have a large amount of memory on the APU, again, like some type of cache, where the CPU, the GPU, plus other stuff, like, for example, an NPU or whatever they end up throwing on there, can all kind of access this cache, and it's going to be really low latency and all this other cool stuff. But it's going to be very interesting to see whether Sony can do this. Again, at this point, I don't have a full specification list for the system. I'm going to be very interested. Like, Sony at this stage, I think we're going to get a PS6. I think there's going to be a PS7, as in like a physical home system. I don't think they're going to be going cloud anytime soon. And frankly, I'll just be honest, guys. I'm not on the whole cloud thing at the moment. I'm just not. Like, if Sony and Nintendo even just continue to pump out consoles where they're local, I personally am all for that. Like, and again, maybe I'm just old, and it's like, even the idea of getting rid of physical media on a console kind of just, it irks me. And I am aware of the irony of that, since I'm a PC, PC gaming whore. With that said, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you found it interesting, but I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.